He had promised himself he would never return to that house. It was a promise made in anger, in grief, in the kind of certainty that only youth can afford. 32 years later, standing at the end of the gravel drive with the late afternoon sun pressing against his shoulders, Thomas understood that some promises are meant to be broken, not because they were wrong when they were made, but because the person who made them no longer exists. The house looked smaller than he remembered, though he knew that was impossible. Stone and mortar do not shrink with time. It was the same structure his grandfather had built in the 1920s, the same wide porch where 3 generations had sat on summer evenings, the same blue shutters his mother had insisted on painting every 5 years. What had changed was him. He had grown around the memory of this place, the way a tree grows around a fence post, distorting both the wood and the bark until neither can exist independently anymore. Thomas set his leather bag on the ground and looked at his hands. They were the hands of a 57-year-old man, weathered and capable, marked by decades of work and worry. They were not the hands of the 25-year-old who had driven away from this place, swearing never to return. That young man had been so certain about everything, so quick to judge, so ready to burn bridges in the name of pride. Thomas wondered what that version of himself would think of him now, standing here with grey at his temples and defeat in his posture. The front door opened before he could knock. Margaret stood in the doorway, older but unmistakably herself, with the same direct gaze that had always made him feel transparent. She did not smile, she did not need to. The recognition between them was instant and complete, the kind of understanding that exists between people who once knew each other's thoughts before they were spoken. "You came," she said. Not a question, not quite a statement. Something in between. "I came," he replied, and the simplicity of the exchange contained multitudes. She stepped aside to let him in, and as he crossed the threshold, Thomas felt something shift inside his chest. It was not nostalgia, though nostalgia was certainly part of it. It was more like the sensation of a bone setting back into place after years of being slightly misaligned, uncomfortable and necessary in equal measure. The interior of the house had been updated, but the bones remained the same. The wide plank floors still creaked in the same places. The staircase still curved to the left with that particular graceful sweep. The afternoon light still fell through the western windows at precisely this angle, illuminating dust motes that hung suspended like tiny planets in their own slow orbits. "Coffee?" Margaret asked, already moving toward the kitchen. "Please." He followed her, noting the way she moved through the space with the confidence of ownership. This had been her grandmother's house, left to Margaret when the old woman died 7 years ago. Thomas had learned about it through a mutual acquaintance, the kind of third-hand information that travels through old networks of connection, even when the primary connections have been severed. He had thought about calling then. He had even picked up the phone twice, but 32 years of silence is a difficult thing to break, and so he had set the phone down again and told himself it was better this way. What had finally brought him back was a letter. Not from Margaret, but from the estate lawyer handling his mother's affairs. His mother had died 3 months ago, and in sorting through her papers, the lawyer had found a sealed envelope with Thomas's name on it, and instructions that it be delivered only after her death. Inside had been a single photograph and a note in his mother's careful handwriting. "Some regrets are heavier than others. Do not carry mine." The photograph was of Thomas and Margaret, taken at the summer party his parents had thrown to celebrate his engagement to Claire. They were standing on this very porch, and Thomas was looking at the camera with the broad smile of a man who believed his life was unfolding exactly as it should. Margaret was looking at Thomas. Even across 3 decades and through the fading chemistry of old film stock, the expression on her face was unmistakable. She looked like someone watching something precious slip away, trying very hard not to show it. Thomas had stared at that photograph for hours, remembering what he had been too blind or too foolish to see at the time. Margaret had been his best friend since childhood. They had grown up together in this house and in his family's house 3 miles down the road, running wild through fields and woods, sharing secrets and dreams, and the kind of perfect companionship that requires no explanation. Everyone had assumed they would eventually marry. Everyone except Thomas, who had somehow convinced himself that what he felt for Margaret was brotherly affection, that the ease between them was friendly rather than foundational. He had met Claire in the city, at a party thrown by mutual colleagues. She had been dazzling and sophisticated, everything that Thomas associated with the life he was building away from this rural corner of the world. He had fallen for her quickly, mistaking excitement for love, mistaking the thrill of conquest for genuine connection. When he had brought her home to meet his parents, Margaret had been there as she always was, part of the family constellation. She had smiled and said all the right things and hugged Claire with what seemed like genuine warmth. She had toasted their engagement and danced at their engagement party and never once suggested that anything was wrong. Thomas had been relieved. He had wanted Margaret's approval more than he had wanted to examine why that approval mattered so much. The wedding had been planned for late September, here at the house under the old oak trees in the garden. But 3 weeks before the ceremony, Claire had ended it. She had done it kindly, or as kindly as such things can be done, explaining that she could see he was in love with someone else even if he could not. "I'm just not sure I'm the person you're pretending I am," she had said, and the accuracy of that statement had felt like a slap. Thomas had been devastated, humiliated, angry at the waste of it all. He had retreated to the house and Margaret had been there as she always was, but something had shifted. For the first time in their lives there was awkwardness between them. Thomas had found himself watching her in ways he never had before, noticing the line of her neck, the way she pushed her hair behind her ear when she was concentrating, the sound of her laugh. It had felt like seeing color for the first time after a lifetime of grayscale. He had tried to talk to her about it one evening, stumbling over words that should have been simple. They had been sitting on the porch, watching fireflies emerge in the dusk, and he had started to say something about how he had been blind, about how he was beginning to understand what had been in front of him all along. But before he could finish, his mother had called Margaret inside to help with something, and the moment had passed. The next day, Margaret had told him she was leaving. She had accepted a job in Boston, she said, something she had been considering for a while. She would be gone within the week. Thomas had felt panic rise in his throat, a desperate need to make her stay, to say all the things he had only just begun to understand. But Margaret had looked at him with something like pity, and Thomas's pride had risen up to meet it. "Running away?" he had asked, and he had meant it to sound light, teasing, but it had come out harsh. "Maybe," she had said, "or maybe just running toward something. What about this place? What about your family? What about them? They'll still be here. You'll still be here. Nothing really changes, does it?" "Everything changes," he had said, and the weight of what was left unsaid had pressed down on both of them. "Then maybe that's good," Margaret had replied, and she had walked away. Thomas had left the next morning before dawn without saying goodbye. He had written a note to his parents explaining that he needed distance, that he could not stay in a place that reminded him of his failures. He had not mentioned Margaret. He had driven back to the city and thrown himself into his work, with the ferocity of a man trying to outrun his own thoughts. Over the years, he had built a successful career, traveled extensively, dated occasionally but never seriously. He had convinced himself that he was content, that the restlessness he felt was simply a personality trait rather than a symptom of deeper loss. He had not returned to the house, not even for holidays. His parents had visited him instead, and if they had been hurt by his absence, they had been too kind to say so. Now Margaret handed him a cup of coffee and sat down across from him at the kitchen table. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, but it was heavy with everything that had accumulated over 3 decades. Thomas tried to think of how to begin, what words could possibly bridge such a gap. "Your mother sent me a letter too," Margaret said finally. "Before she died, she wanted me to know that she understood, that she had always understood." Thomas looked up sharply. "Understood what?" Margaret's smile was sad. "Why I left. Why you left. Why we both ran from something we should have run toward." "I was a fool," Thomas said, and the words came out raw, unplanned. "We both were," Margaret replied. "You for not seeing, me for not speaking. You shouldn't have had to speak. I should have known, I should have... Should have what? Read my mind, Thomas? We were young, we were scared. You were grieving a broken engagement, and I was grieving something that never even got to exist. We were both looking at the same truth from different angles, and neither of us had the courage to name it. Thomas set down his coffee cup because his hands were shaking slightly. When I got my mother's letter, when I saw that photograph, it was like something unlocked inside me. Not just understanding what I had lost, but understanding how long I've been living like a man underwater, never quite able to breathe properly. Margaret reached across the table and placed her hand over his. Her touch was warm and familiar, and entirely new all at once. "I know," she said. "I've been holding my breath too." They sat like that for a long moment, hands touching, years collapsing between them. Then Margaret withdrew her hand and stood, moving to the window. "I need you to understand something before we go any further. I'm not the girl you remember. I'm not even the woman who left here 32 years ago. I've built a life, I've had relationships, I've been married and divorced. I've been happy and sad and angry and at peace. I've changed." "So have I," Thomas said. "I know, that's my point. We can't pick up where we left off because where we left off doesn't exist anymore. Those people are gone. Then what do we do?" Margaret turned to face him, and the afternoon light behind her created a halo effect that made Thomas's chest ache. "We decide if we want to start something new, not a continuation, not a correction of the past, something entirely new, built by who we are now, not who we were then." Thomas stood and walked to where she stood. He could smell her shampoo, something floral and subtle. He could see the fine lines around her eyes, the silver threaded through her hair, the slight stoop in her shoulders that came from years of carrying weight, both literal and metaphorical. She was beautiful in the way that only truth can be beautiful, unadorned and essential. "I want that," he said, "if you'll let me try." "It won't be simple," Margaret warned. "I live here now. My work is here. I can't uproot my life again." "I'm not asking you to. I'm asking if there's room for me in it. You'd move here, leave the city?" "The city was never home. It was just a place I went to hide." Margaret studied him for a long moment, and Thomas forced himself to remain still under her gaze, to let her see whatever she needed to see. Finally she nodded, just once, a small decisive gesture that felt like the opening of a door. "We'll take it slow," she said. "We'll be honest. No more silence, no more assumptions. If this is going to work, we have to be brave enough to say the true things, even when they're uncomfortable." "Especially when they're uncomfortable," Thomas agreed. They moved through the house together, Margaret showing him the changes she had made, the rooms she had updated, the garden she had expanded. Thomas found himself relaxing into the rhythm of her presence, the easy back and forth of conversation that had always characterized their relationship. But now there was something else underneath it, a current of possibility that had not been there before, or perhaps had always been there, but had finally been acknowledged. As evening approached, they returned to the porch, sitting side by side on the old wooden swing that had been there since Thomas was a child. The motion was soothing, hypnotic, a gentle back and forth that seemed to mirror the way they were navigating this new territory between them. "Tell me about your life," Thomas said. The real version, not the edited highlights. So Margaret told him. She told him about moving to Boston, about the initial excitement and the gradual realization that she was still carrying him with her. She told him about meeting David, a kind man who had loved her patiently, even though she could never quite give him all of herself. She told him about their marriage, which had been comfortable but not passionate, and about the divorce, which had been mutual and surprisingly painless. She told him about coming back to the house after her grandmother died, about the sense of coming full circle, about deciding to stay. "I thought about you often," she admitted. "Wondered where you were, what you were doing, whether you had found what you were looking for." "I hadn't," Thomas said. "I spent 32 years looking for something I had already found and thrown away." "You didn't throw me away, you just didn't know how to hold on." "Is there a difference?" "Yes," Margaret said firmly. "Intent matters. You weren't cruel. You were just confused." Thomas leaned back, looking up at the porch ceiling, at the old light fixture that had been there since his childhood. "My mother knew. In that letter she said she was sorry for not speaking up, for not pushing me to see what was right in front of me. She said she thought we needed to figure it out ourselves, but that by the time she realized we weren't going to, it was too late. We had both already left. She was a wise woman, Margaret said. But even wise people can't live other people's lives for them. I wasted so much time. You lived your life. Maybe not the life you could have had, but a life nonetheless. That's not waste. That's just the way things unfold. Thomas turned to look at her. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I had seen it sooner? If I had never met Claire, or if I had understood what I felt before the engagement? Sometimes, Margaret admitted, but mostly I try not to. That way lies madness. We can't know what those other versions of our lives would have been. Maybe they would have been better. Maybe we would have destroyed each other because we were too young and too tangled up in family expectations. Maybe we needed these 32 years to become people who could actually build something lasting. Is that what you think? Margaret was quiet for a moment, considering. I think we're here now. That's what matters. We can't change the past, but we can decide what we do with the present. They sat in comfortable silence as the light faded and the first stars appeared. Thomas felt something settle inside him, a sense of rightness that he had not experienced in decades. It was not the wild excitement of new love, though there was attraction there, shimmering beneath the surface. It was something deeper and more durable, a recognition of fundamental compatibility, of two people who fit together in ways that went beyond romance. Stay for dinner, Margaret said. I made too much pasta anyway. Thomas smiled. I'd like that. They moved inside and Thomas found himself helping in the kitchen without being asked, the old choreography of working together reasserting itself naturally. They moved around each other smoothly, anticipating needs and preferences without discussion. It felt both familiar and entirely new, like remembering a song you had forgotten you knew. Over dinner, they talked about smaller things. Margaret's work in landscape design, which allowed her to combine her love of plants with her practical skills. Thomas's career in architecture, which had taken him all over the world, but had never quite satisfied the ache for something more meaningful. They talked about books they had read, places they had been, people they had known. The conversation flowed easily, punctuated by laughter and moments of comfortable silence. After dinner, they cleaned up together, and then Margaret poured them each a glass of wine. They returned to the porch, where the night had settled in fully, bringing with it the sound of crickets and the smell of honeysuckle from the garden. Can I ask you something? Thomas said after a while. Of course. If I had come back sooner, say 10 years ago, would you have wanted to see me? Margaret considered this carefully. 10 years ago I was still married. I was still pretending that I could make that work through sheer force of will, so probably not, or at least not in any way that would have mattered. But 5 years ago? Maybe. 3 years ago, definitely. But I didn't come 3 years ago. No, you came now, and that's when you were ready. Thomas nodded slowly. I'm not sure I'm entirely ready even now. This is terrifying. It should be, Margaret said. If it wasn't terrifying, it wouldn't matter. What happens tomorrow? Thomas asked. I have to go back to the city. I have work, obligations, an apartment full of things that need to be dealt with. Then you go back, Margaret said simply. You take care of what needs to be taken care of. And then you decide what you want. If you want to explore this, really explore it, then we'll figure out the logistics. If you decide it's too complicated or too late or just not right, then we'll accept that. But Thomas, I need you to be sure. I can't do this halfway. I can't be your nostalgia trip or your midlife crisis cure. If you're in, you have to be all in. I understand, Thomas said, and I am in. I know that probably sounds rash, given that I've been here for all of 6 hours, but I'm not 25 anymore. I know what I want, I know what I've been missing, and I'm not interested in wasting any more time. Margaret reached over and took his hand. Then we'll make a plan. Real steps, real timeline. You'll go back and take care of your life there. I'll give you space to think clearly, without the romance of this house clouding your judgment. We'll talk every day if you want, or every week if you need distance. But in 3 months you'll come back, and we'll have an honest conversation about whether this is something we can really build. 3 months, Thomas repeated. 3 months. And if after that time you still feel the same way, then we start planning a life together. But Thomas, you need to be certain. Because I'm certain. I've had 32 years to be certain. Thomas felt tears prick at his eyes, though he did not let them fall. "You've been waiting for me." "Not waiting," Margaret corrected gently. "Living, building, growing, becoming someone who could be a good partner if the opportunity arose. But hoping, yes. I've been hoping." They sat together until late into the night, talking and not talking, planning and not planning, simply existing in each other's presence in a way that felt both miraculous and entirely natural. When Thomas finally stood to leave, because he was staying at a hotel in town and did not want to presume too much, Margaret walked him to his car. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Thank you for being brave enough to try." "Thank you for letting me," Thomas replied. They stood in the driveway, neither quite ready to say goodbye, even though it was only temporary. Finally, Margaret leaned in and kissed him lightly on the cheek. "Drive safely," she whispered. Thomas got in his car and started the engine, but he sat there for a moment, looking at Margaret in his rearview mirror. She stood in the pool of light from the porch watching him, and for the first time in 3 decades, Thomas felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be, even as he prepared to leave. The drive back to the city took 4 hours, and Thomas spent them thinking about everything and nothing. He thought about the young man who had driven away from this house in anger and confusion, certain that he was escaping something that would drag him down. He thought about all the years he had spent convincing himself that he was fine, that his life was full enough, that the hollow feeling in his chest was just a natural part of aging. He thought about Margaret, about the way she had looked at him with such clear-eyed honesty, offering him a chance but not begging for it. She had become someone extraordinary, and Thomas felt humbled by the realization that she had done it without him, that she had built a full life in his absence. He was not riding in to save her or complete her. He was being offered the opportunity to walk alongside her if he proved worthy of it. Back in his apartment, which suddenly felt sterile and lifeless, Thomas looked around at the accumulation of his adult life. None of it meant anything. The expensive furniture, the carefully curated art, the professional accomplishments documented in framed certificates and awards. It all felt like set dressing for a play he had been performing rather than a life he had been living. He picked up the phone and called his office, requesting a meeting with his supervisor for the following day. Then he started making a list of everything that would need to happen for him to relocate. It was a long list, but not an insurmountable one. Lease termination, job search, packing, logistics. All solvable problems. The 3 months that followed were both the longest and the shortest of Thomas's life. He and Margaret talked every few days, careful conversations that were friendly, but not overly intimate, giving each other space while maintaining connection. Thomas threw himself into the practical work of dismantling his city life. He gave notice at his job, found a position with a smaller firm that would allow him to work remotely most of the time, started sorting through 30 years of accumulated possessions. His colleagues were surprised but supportive. His friends, the few he had maintained over the years, were less so. They warned him about making major life decisions based on emotion, about the dangers of trying to recapture the past. Thomas listened politely and ignored them. They did not understand that he was not trying to recapture anything. He was trying to create something entirely new with tools he had not possessed when he was younger. 6 weeks into the 3-month period, Thomas received a call from Margaret. Her voice sounded different, strained. "I need to tell you something," she said. Thomas's heart clenched. "Okay. I've been offered a project. A big one, designing the landscape for a new resort in Colorado. It's a 2-year commitment, and it would mean being on site at least part of the time. I'd have to travel back and forth." "That's wonderful," Thomas said, though his mind was already calculating what this would mean for them. "Is it? Thomas, I need to know if you're serious about this, because if you are, I'll turn it down. I can find other projects. But if there's any doubt in your mind, if you're not absolutely certain, then I need to take this opportunity." Thomas closed his eyes. This was the test, he realized. Margaret was asking him to prove, through action rather than words, that he meant what he said. "Take the project," he said. There was silence on the other end of the line. "What?" "Take the project. It's an incredible opportunity. I don't want to be the reason you turn down your dreams. We'll figure out how to make it work." "Thomas, Margaret." Listen to me. I spent 32 years running from my life. I'm not going to ask you to do the same. We're both going to keep being who we are, doing the work we love, and we're going to build something together in the spaces between. That's what partnership is, isn't it? Not sacrificing for each other, but adapting to each other. He could hear her breathing, the catch in it that might have been tears or laughter or both. You're sure? I've never been more sure of anything in my life. Okay, she said. Okay. The remaining 6 weeks passed in a blur of logistics and planning. Thomas finalized his move, packed up his apartment, said his goodbyes. On the day before his lease ended, he loaded everything he was keeping into a small moving truck and drove back to the house. Margaret was waiting for him on the porch. This time, there was no hesitation. Thomas got out of the truck and walked straight to her, and she met him halfway. They embraced, and Thomas felt something click into place inside his chest, that misaligned bone finally settling properly after decades of discomfort. "Welcome home," Margaret said. "Home," Thomas repeated, testing the word. It fit. They spent the next few days settling Thomas into the house. Margaret had cleared space in her closet and her life, making room for him physically and emotionally. They negotiated household responsibilities with the care of two people who understood that small accommodations build strong foundations. They established routines and rhythms, figuring out how to coexist in shared space after decades of living alone. It was not always easy. They had both become set in their ways, and merging two established lives required patience and compromise. Thomas learned to adapt to Margaret's morning routine, her need for quiet before coffee, her habit of falling asleep with a book on her chest. Margaret learned to tolerate Thomas's tendency to rearrange things for better efficiency, his need to take long walks when he was thinking through a problem, his habit of talking to himself when he was working. But underneath the minor frictions of daily life, there was something solid and true. They fit together in the ways that mattered, their values aligned, their communication was honest, their respect for each other was absolute. And slowly, as the days turned into weeks, the physical intimacy that had been implicit began to develop naturally. The first time they kissed, really kissed, was on a rainy afternoon about 3 weeks after Thomas moved in. They had been working together in the garden, transplanting some bushes that Margaret wanted to relocate, and they had come inside muddy and laughing. In the kitchen, reaching around each other to wash hands and grab towels, their eyes met and something shifted. Thomas cupped Margaret's face in his still damp hands and kissed her, and she kissed him back, and it felt both like the first time and like something they had been doing forever. "About time," Margaret murmured when they broke apart. "I wanted to do it right," Thomas said. "I wanted to earn it." "You've earned it," Margaret assured him. "Now stop overthinking and kiss me again." Their physical relationship developed slowly and without drama. Two mature people who understood their bodies and desires, who could communicate needs and boundaries clearly. It was not the desperate passion of youth, but something deeper and more sustainable, intimacy built on genuine knowledge and affection. As autumn arrived, Margaret began traveling for her Colorado project. She was gone for a week at a time, sometimes 2, and Thomas used those periods to establish his own work routine, to find his place in the community, to build a life that was his own while still being intertwined with hers. When she returned, they would reconnect with the ease of long-established partners, sharing stories and experiences, finding their rhythm again without difficulty. Thomas joined the local historical society and began volunteering his architectural expertise for restoration projects. He reconnected with a few old friends from his youth who were still in the area, building a social network that was separate from Margaret but complementary to their relationship. He was not trying to become who he had been. He was discovering who he could be in this place, with this person at this stage of his life. One evening in late October, they were sitting on the porch, wrapped in blankets, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Margaret was leaning against Thomas, his arm around her shoulders, both of them quiet and content. "Do you regret it?" Margaret asked suddenly. "The lost years?" Thomas thought about the question carefully. "I regret the pain I caused. I regret not understanding sooner. But no, I don't regret the years themselves. They made me who I am. They made you who you are. And who we are now is pretty good." "Pretty good," Margaret teased. "Okay, better than pretty good. Remarkable. Unexpected. Right. That's more like it." Thomas tightened his arm around her. "Can I tell you something?" "Always. I love you. I've loved you for most of my life, I think, even when I didn't know it. And I'm grateful that we got a second chance. I'm grateful that you were patient enough to wait for me to grow up." Margaret turned to look at him, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I love you too. I always have. And I'm grateful that you were brave enough to come back." They sat together as the sun disappeared below the horizon and the first stars emerged. The house around them, the house that had been the center of so much joy and pain, stood solid and enduring. Inside its walls, two people who had lost their way had found their way back, not to who they used to be, but to who they could become together. Thomas thought about the young man who had driven away from this place in anger and grief, swearing never to return. He thought about all the years of restless searching, of building a life that looked successful from the outside but felt hollow inside. He thought about the moment he had stood at the end of the gravel drive, uncertain and afraid, not knowing if he would be welcomed or turned away. He had promised himself he would never return, but promises made in pain are not the same as promises made in wisdom. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is admit you were wrong. Sometimes the greatest strength is in surrender rather than defiance. Sometimes you have to lose something completely before you can understand its value. Thomas had lost Margaret, and in losing her he had lost himself. But in finding his way back to her, he had found his way back to truth. Not the easy truth of youth, which is often just certainty masquerading as wisdom, but the harder truth of experience, which understands that some things are worth waiting for, worth fighting for, worth building slowly and carefully over time. The house stood witness to their reunion, as it had stood witness to generations of love and loss before them. Its walls contained memories of joy and sorrow, of beginnings and endings, of the full complexity of human connection. And now it contained this new beginning, this second chance, this proof that it is never too late to choose love over pride, connection over independence, presence over absence. As the night deepened and the temperature dropped, Thomas and Margaret moved inside. They locked the doors, turned off the lights, and climbed the stairs to the bedroom they now shared. Outside, the world continued its rotation, indifferent to individual human dramas. But inside the house, in the quiet intimacy of shared space and shared commitment, two people who had once been lost were finally, imperfectly, completely found. Some stories end with grand gestures and dramatic declarations. This one ended quietly, with the simple decision to stay, to try, to build something real out of the wreckage of wasted years. It ended with the understanding that love is not always loud or obvious, that sometimes it whispers rather than shouts, that sometimes it takes 3 decades to hear its voice clearly. Thomas had promised himself he would never return to that house. But in breaking that promise, he had kept a different one, made unconsciously years ago to a girl who had loved him before he knew how to love himself. He had come home, not to a place, though the place mattered, but to a person, to Margaret, to the possibility of building something true and lasting with someone who knew him completely and loved him anyway. And Margaret, who had carried her own promise silently for 3 decades, the promise to remain open to possibility, even when hope seemed foolish, had been rewarded for her patience. She had built a full life in his absence, but she had left space for him to return. And when he finally did, she had been brave enough to let him in. If you have ever loved someone and lost them through your own blindness, through fear or pride or simple failure to understand what was right in front of you, then you know the particular ache that lives in Thomas's story. If you have ever been Margaret, loving someone who could not see you, waiting with dignity and hope for them to finally understand, then you know the courage it takes to remain open when closing off would be so much easier. Some loves wait patiently in the wings, quiet and constant, until the people involved are ready to step into them. Some promises are meant to be broken because the person who made them was not yet fully formed. This is a story about second chances, but also about the work required to deserve them, about the courage to return and the grace to welcome someone back. Share your own story of love found late, or chances taken bravely, or promises broken in service of deeper truths.